401 BC. The Mesopotamian night, thick and black as spilled oil, descends upon the camp of 10,000 Greek mercenaries. The air, white-hot by day, now carries the chill of the starry desert and the heavy Swedish smell of blood and death. A few hours ago, the Battle of Cunaxa raged. The Greek phalanx, that unbreakable wall of shields and spears, once again proved its superiority, crushing and routing the 100,000-strong army of the Persian king Artaxerxes II. They were victorious, but their victory is merely bitter dust in the wind. Their employer, Cyrus the Younger, a pretender to the Persian throne, is dead, having fallen in a reckless charge against his brother, the king. And now, deep in enemy territory, thousands of kilometers from their native Aegean Sea, the victors find themselves trapped. This afternoon, the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, a cunning master of intrigue, under the pretext of peace negotiations, lured the 5 senior Greek commanders, including the Spartan Clearchus, to his quarters and treacherously executed them. Their severed heads, as ancient authors testify, were triumphantly displayed to the Persian army. The news of this monstrous betrayal has just reached the Greek camp, paralyzing the army like a lightning strike paralyzes a bull. 10,000 battle-hardened veterans, men who had passed through the fire and water of the Peloponnesian War, have suddenly become a flock without shepherds. Despair, sticky and all-pervading, thickens around the campfires. The soldiers stare silently into the flames, their eyes reflecting the full horror of their situation. They are a headless body, a foreign organ in the very heart of a gigantic, hostile empire that will now slowly and methodically digest them. The question that hangs in the air, heavier than a tombstone, is, what now? Surrender to the mercy of a treacherous enemy and end their lives in slavery? Or perish here, in the endless dust between the Tigris and Euphrates? It seems there is no third way. The army is dead. It just doesn't know it yet. It is on this night of absolute darkness, when hope itself seems like madness, that a leader must be born from the ranks of ordinary officers, a leader capable of answering the unspoken question, how? How to turn this march to inevitable doom into a journey home. To understand how this drama became possible, we must look at the world at the end of the 5th century BC. It was an era of great upheaval, a world standing on a tectonic fault line of history. The Hellenic world had just emerged from the crucible of the Peloponnesian War, nearly 3 decades of fratricidal slaughter that had exhausted the city-states and left deep scars. Athens, once the shining hegemon, was humiliated and defeated by Sparta. But Sparta, the victor, had also paid a terrible price. The economy of all of Greece was in ruins, and society was flooded with thousands of men who knew nothing but how to fight. These veterans, professional hoplites accustomed to discipline, risk, and blood, found themselves jobless. They were the ideal material for mercenary work, a living commodity on the military market, ready to sell their spears to the highest bidder. At the same time, in the east, lay the Persian Achaemenid Empire, a colossal state stretching from the Aegean Sea to India. For the Greeks, it was the eternal enemy, a symbol of Eastern despotism and barbarian luxury. But this colossus stood on feet of clay. The court of the great king in Susa was a nest of vipers, where satraps plotted conspiracies and the royal family was consumed by power struggles. Immediately after the death of Darius II, his eldest son Arsaces ascended the throne, taking the name Artaxerxes II. But his younger brother, Cyrus the Younger, the satrap of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia, ambitious, energetic, and beloved by many, believed the throne rightfully belonged to him. It was he, his supporters claimed, who was born when his father was already king, whereas Artaxerxes was born when his father was merely a prince. This dynastic dispute was the spark that ignited the fire. Cyrus, who had close contacts with the Greeks and admired their military prowess, saw in the thousands of unemployed Hellenic veterans the perfect tool to seize power. He began secretly assembling an army, and streams of mercenaries from all over Greece flowed to his capital, Sardis. Thus, two forces converged: a surplus of military energy in Greece and a power vacuum in Persia. This collision created the historical storm at whose epicenter an Athenian aristocrat named Xenophon would find himself. In this stream of rugged, battle-hardened warriors flocking to Cyrus, Xenophon was an oddity. He was neither an experienced Spartan general nor a coarse Arcadian mercenary. He was a son of Athens, an aristocrat from the cavalry class, a man whose main battlefield had hitherto been not the dust of combat, but the intellectual disputes of the Athenian agora. His background and upbringing made him an outsider in this environment, but it was precisely these qualities that would become the key to his future role. Xenophon was born around 430 BC into a prosperous family, which gave him the opportunity to receive the best education Athens could offer. From a young age, he was passionate about horsemanship and hunting, which hardened his body, but his true passion was philosophy. Fate brought him together with the greatest mind of the era, Socrates. Xenophon became one of his most devoted students, and the shadow of this controversial philosopher would hang over his entire life. While other young men of his circle dreamed of military glory and a traditional political career, Xenophon learned from Socrates the art of dialectic, the ability to ask the right questions, to expose contradictions in an opponent's judgments, and most importantly, to know oneself. He absorbed the idea that virtue is knowledge, and the highest goal of man is the perfection of the soul. This philosophical baggage seemed utterly useless for the upcoming campaign. What do the subtleties of ethics and logic matter in the face of Persian cavalry? However, it was this education that shaped his unique mindset, which would allow him to think outside the box, to analyze situations not only from a military, but also from a psychological perspective, and to find words capable of igniting the hearts of thousands of desperate men. He was not just a warrior. He was a thinking warrior, a man for whom a logical argument was as important as a sharp spear. And although his connection with Socrates, whom Athens would later condemn to death, would cast a shadow of suspicion upon him and eventually lead to his exile, it was the Socratic method that would become the invisible weapon he carried across all of Asia. The ancient world was steeped in a belief in omens, prophecies, and the will of the gods. No important undertaking began without consulting an oracle or offering sacrifices, and Xenophon's journey into the heart of Persia started with just such a mystical act, which, as is often the case with predictions, turned out to be full of ambiguity. His friend, Proxenus the Boeotian, who was already serving under Cyrus the Younger, sent him a letter inviting him to join the expedition, promising the friendship of the powerful Persian prince, wealth and glory. Xenophon, young and ambitious, was intrigued, but as a true Athenian of his time, he decided to consult the gods. However, before doing so, he sought the advice of his earthly mentor, Socrates. The philosopher, sensing danger and knowing that Cyrus had been an ally of Sparta in the recent war against Athens, warned his student that participating in this enterprise could bring the wrath of his native city upon him. Nevertheless, he advised Xenophon to go to Delphi and ask Apollo about the upcoming journey. And here, Xenophon committed an act of subtle, almost legalistic cunning that speaks volumes about his character. Instead of asking the oracle the direct question, "Should I go or not?" he asked, "To which gods should I sacrifice and pray in order that I may best accomplish my intended journey and return in safety?" The oracle gave him an answer, listing the necessary gods. Upon returning to Athens, Xenophon told Socrates everything, and the philosopher reproached him for his craftiness. By phrasing the question as he did, Xenophon had already decided he would go on the campaign and was merely asking the gods for a safety manual. He wasn't seeking permission, he was seeking a blessing. This episode is a key to understanding his personality. He was not a passive pawn of fate. He was an active architect of his own life, a man who used even religious rituals to achieve his own goals. He believed in the gods, but he also believed in the power of human reason and will. This omen did not give him guarantees, but it armed him with the confidence that he had secured the support of higher powers. This confidence, this subtle combination of piety and pragmatism, would become one of the pillars of his leadership in those dark days when it seemed that all the gods had turned their backs on the Greeks. The forge that shaped Xenophon's unique character was not the military camps or gymnasia, but the conversations on the dusty streets of Athens. The years spent alongside Socrates were his true school of leadership, though he didn't realize it at the time. Socrates taught not facts, but a method. His famous mutics, or the art of midwifery, consisted of using leading questions to help his interlocutor give birth to the truth himself. He didn't provide ready-made answers. He made people think. For Xenophon, this was an invaluable lesson. He learned to analyze any problem by breaking it down into its constituent parts, identifying hidden assumptions and false arguments. In the future, at war councils in the middle of enemy territory, this ability would allow him to see situations more clearly than others and to propose solutions based on cold logic rather than panic or emotion. Moreover, Socrates paid great attention to rhetoric, the art of persuasion. But this was not the sophistry aimed at proving anything, but rhetoric based on truth and goodness. Xenophon saw how his teacher could calm an angry crowd with a single word, inspire the doubtful, or stump an overconfident ignoramus. He understood that the word could be a more powerful weapon than the sword. This ability would become his main tool when he had to turn a demoralized mob into a cohesive army. His famous speech after the murder of the generals is a pure example of Socratic dialectic applied in an extreme situation. He does not command. He asks. He does not assert. He leads his listeners through a chain of logical deductions to the only correct conclusion. They must fight for their lives. Finally, Socrates instilled in him a deep sense of duty and responsibility. A leader, in Socrates' view, is not one who holds power, but one who knows better than others what needs to be done and cares for the welfare of his subordinates, as a shepherd cares for his flock. Xenophon would carry this idea through the entire campaign, sharing all hardships with the soldiers, marching on foot in the rearguard, helping the sick and the stragglers. He would become for them not just a commander, but a mentor, a father, and a savior. Thus, the years spent in the shadow of the Athenian philosopher armed Xenophon with an invisible armor and an unseen sword, critical thinking, the gift of persuasion, and a moral compass, which allowed him to achieve the impossible. When Xenophon arrived in Sardis in the spring of 401 BC, he was not yet a soldier or a commander in this army. He was, in essence, a tourist, attracted by the promises of his friend Proxenus. His first tentative step was not into battle, but into this world of professional warriors, a world that was both alien and alluring to him. He joined the expedition as a private individual, an observer who wanted to see a great war, to discover new lands, and perhaps to gain that very glory, kleos, which was so important to any Hellene. His status was undefined, and this gave him a unique vantage point. He was not burdened by the responsibility of command, nor was he a common hoplite in the ranks. He could observe, analyze, and communicate with commanders and soldiers, delving into the complex mechanics of this military organism. From the very beginning, he was confronted with the reality of mercenary life. This was an army assembled not out of patriotism, but for money. It included Spartans, Arcadians, Achaeans, Thessalians, representatives of dozens of Greek city-states, often at odds with each other back home. They were united only by a common profession and loyalty to their paymaster. Xenophon watched as Cyrus, a skillful politician and psychologist, managed this diverse crowd, sometimes with generosity, sometimes with flattery, and sometimes with a firm hand. He studied the characters of the commanders, the stern and authoritarian Spartan Clearchus, the gentle and friendly Proxenus, the cunning Thessalian Menon. This was his first practical education in military psychology. The first real test for him, as for the entire army, was Cyrus's deception. The Persian prince had hired them supposedly for a campaign against a rebellious satrap in Pisidia. But as the army delved deeper and deeper into the east, it became clear that the true goal was the throne of Persia. In Tarsus, the soldiers mutinied, refusing to go any further. It was here that Xenophon first saw how such crises were resolved. Clearchus, risking his life, managed to quell the rebellion through a combination of tears, persuasion, and a promise of higher pay. For Xenophon, it was a lesson. This army was not a soulless machine, but a living, capricious organism that could only be controlled by understanding its needs and fears. His own step had been taken. He remained with the army, definitively tying his fate to this adventure. He had not yet shed blood, but he had already made a choice that transformed him from an observer into a participant in a great drama. Behind every great deed, there is often not only a noble impulse, but also a deeply personal, sometimes hidden motivation. What truly drew Xenophon, the Athenian intellectual, into this risky adventure? The money and friendship with Cyrus, which Proxenus wrote about, were merely the outward, convenient reasons. The true engine of his actions, his inner demon, was far more complex and multifaceted. Firstly, it was the thirst for glory, for kleos, a fundamental concept in Greek culture. Kleos is eternal remembrance in songs and stories, the only form of immortality available to mortals. Xenophon, raised on the epics of Homer, dreamed of accomplishing something that would inscribe his name in history alongside Achilles and Odysseus. Athens, after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War, was a place of gloom and mutual recrimination. A great expedition into the heart of fabled Persia seemed to him a chance to escape this oppressive atmosphere and become the hero of a new epic. Secondly, it was a drive for self-realization and self-affirmation. Xenophon was a man of action, burdened by purely theoretical pursuits. He wanted to prove, primarily to himself, that the philosophy he learned from Socrates was not useless intellectualism detached from life. He was convinced that the principles of reason, order, and self-discipline that his teacher spoke of could and should be applied in the harshest conditions, in war, in politics, in managing people. This expedition was a giant existential experiment for him. Could a philosopher survive and succeed in a world of brute force? Could knowledge be more effective than a sword? This internal question was his secret motivation. He didn't just want to participate, he wanted to test his ideas in practice, to prove the viability of Socratic ethics in a world that seemed to be ruled only by the law of the strong. Finally, one cannot discount a certain political escapism. Xenophon belonged to the aristocratic pro-Spartan circles that were out of favor with the Athenian democracy, especially after the trauma of the war. His association with Socrates, whom many Democrats considered a corrupter of the youth, also made his position precarious. To embark on a distant campaign meant to escape the political uncertainty and potential dangers at home. Thus, his journey to the East was not just an adventure, but a complex fusion of ambition, intellectual quest, and flight, which prepared the ground for his future transformation from observer to leader. Having assembled an army of about 13,000 Greek mercenaries and nearly 100,000 Asian warriors, Cyrus the Younger began his great march in the spring of 401 BC. For the Greeks, it was the beginning of a journey into the unknown, one that with each step increasingly resembled a well-laid trap. Officially, the expedition's goal was to deal with unruly mountain tribes in Pisidia, in the Taurus Mountains. This was a plausible and understandable objective for the mercenaries, a short, profitable campaign. However, Cyrus's true plan, to overthrow his own brother, Artaxerxes II, from the Persian throne, was kept a closely guarded secret. This deception was necessary. It was unlikely that the Greeks, for all their courage and lust for gold, would have readily agreed to a suicidal war against the great king in the very heart of his empire. The march into the interior of Asia was masterfully organized. Cyrus led his troops through his satrapies in Asia Minor, paying the soldiers generously and turning a blind eye to minor looting to maintain their morale. But as the army passed Pisidia and continued eastward, suspicion grew among the Greeks. In the city of Tarsus, in Cilicia, the tension reached a breaking point. The soldiers realized they were not being led against some mountain tribes, but against the king himself. A mutiny erupted. The mercenaries refused to go any further, and Cyrus's position became critical. It was at this moment that the talent of the Spartan Clearchus, the de facto leader of the Greek contingent, became apparent. At first, he tried to force the soldiers to obey, but he was nearly stoned. Then he resorted to cunning. He pretended to renounce his service to Cyrus and march back with the soldiers, while vividly describing all the hardships of a return journey through hostile lands without guides or provisions. His speech, in which he spoke with tears in his eyes of his loyalty to the soldiers, had its effect. The Greeks, seeing their stern commander broken, felt ashamed and agreed to stay, having negotiated a pay raise from Cyrus. This episode, witnessed by Xenophon, was an important lesson for him in managing the masses. But the point of no return was crossed when the army reached the Euphrates River near the city of Thapsacus. Here, Cyrus finally revealed his true objective. Shock gave way to resignation. There was no way back. After crossing the great river, the 10,000 Greeks entered the very heart of the Persian Empire, transforming from mercenaries into rebels who had gambled everything on the ambitions of one man. They had become a blind but deadly instrument in a great game of thrones. The culmination of Cyrus's daring campaign and the first act of the great tragedy of the 10,000 was the Battle of Cunaxa, which took place in September 401 BC, about 80 kilometers north of Babylon. Here, on a vast plain, the pretender's army clashed with the main forces of his brother, King Artaxerxes II. According to various estimates, The royal army numbered from 400,000 to nearly 1,000,000 warriors, including the infamous scythed chariots designed to cut through infantry ranks. Cyrus's forces were significantly smaller, about 13,000 Greeks and up to 100,000 Asian soldiers. However, the core of his army, his main asset, was the Greek phalanx, an unbreakable wall of shields and spears, hardened by decades of the Peloponnesian War. Cyrus positioned the Greeks on the right, the striking flank, under the command of Clearchus, while he himself, with a contingent of 600 elite horsemen, took up a position in the center, intending to personally engage his brother. The battle began with a charge of the Persian chariots, but the Greeks, as Xenophon testifies, met them with composure and ridicule. The soldiers parted their ranks, letting the speeding chariots pass through harmlessly. Immediately after, the phalanx, letting out a battle cry, the paean, moved forward as a single monolith. The sight of the bristling wall of spears marching steadily and inexorably towards them caused panic among the Persian soldiers facing them. They broke and fled without even weathering the first charge. The left flank of the royal army was completely routed, and the Greeks pursued the fleeing enemy for many kilometers. Tactically, it was a resounding triumph, further proof of the absolute superiority of the Hellenic war machine. But while victory was being celebrated on the right flank, a tragedy was unfolding in the center. Cyrus, noticing that Artaxerxes' center was weakened, made a fatal mistake. Consumed by rage and lust for power, instead of consolidating the overall success, he led a small detachment in a suicidal charge directly at his brother. He managed to wound Artaxerxes, but in the ensuing melee, he was surrounded and killed by a javelin that, according to tradition, struck him under the eye. With Cyrus's death, the entire campaign instantly lost its meaning. The Greeks had brilliantly won their battle but had strategically lost everything. Their victory was orphaned and useless, like a gleaming sword left on the battlefield next to the body of its master. The death of Cyrus the Younger was the stone that started an avalanche. For the Greek mercenaries, it was a moment of truth, a crossroads of fate where their path abruptly ended, leaving them in complete disarray in the middle of a hostile world. The news of their leader's demise did not reach them immediately. Returning to the battlefield after a long pursuit, they found neither Cyrus nor the rest of his army, and only the next morning did they learn the terrible truth from Artaxerxes' messengers. Their situation changed in an instant. From a victorious army, the vanguard of what they believed to be the rightful claimant to the throne, they were transformed into a band of rebels, outsiders without a purpose or a patron. The first offer they received from the king was humiliating: lay down their arms and surrender to the mercy of the victor. For free Hellenes, for whom their weapons were a symbol of their status and their very lives, this was tantamount to suicide. Clearchus, who had taken command, proudly replied to the Persian envoys with the famous phrase, "Victors do not surrender their arms." It was a brave but desperate bluff. Both the Greeks and the Persians understood the real balance of power. The mercenaries were an island in the vast ocean of the Persian Empire. They had no provisions, no guides who knew the terrain, and no hope of outside help. Their only asset was their combat effectiveness. It was at this moment that they faced a fateful choice. They could try to fight their way south to Babylon, but that meant war with the full might of the Persian army. They could try to find a new employer among the local satraps, but who could be trusted? Or they could try to negotiate with the king for safe passage to the coast. It was this last, most treacherous option that was offered to them by the satrap Tissaphernes, a longtime enemy of Cyrus and one of Artaxerxes' chief commanders. He arrived at the Greek camp feigning friendship and offered to be their guide and supply them with provisions on their way home. For the exhausted and disoriented army, this proposal seemed like a salvation. They did not yet know that by accepting this help, they were stepping into a carefully laid death trap. The fateful act of the drama, which finally plunged the Greeks into the abyss of despair, was played out with a cynical cruelty worthy of the Persian court. The chief architect of this tragedy was the satrap Tissaphernes. This cunning and treacherous politician, who had dealt with Greeks before and knew their strengths and weaknesses well, understood that destroying 10,000 hoplites in open battle would be difficult and bloody. Therefore, he chose the path of betrayal. After several days of marching together, during which Tissaphernes lulled the Greeks' vigilance with a show of friendliness, he proposed a meeting with their commanders for decisive negotiations to finally resolve all misunderstandings between them. He claimed there were slanderers in the Greek camp trying to create a rift between him and the Hellenes, and suggested that all the senior commanders, the generals and captains, come to his tent to publicly identify and punish the culprits. Despite the suspicions of some officers, the chief general, the Spartan Clearchus, trusted Tissaphernes. Perhaps his Spartan directness did not allow him to fully believe in such sophisticated treachery, or perhaps he simply saw no other way out of the situation. He persuaded the other commanders to accept the invitation. 5 generals, Clearchus, Proxenus, Xenophon's friend, Menon, Augeas, and Socrates, an Achaean, not the philosopher, and 20 captains set off for the Persian camp. As soon as they entered Tissaphernes' tent, on a prearranged signal, they were seized. The 20 captains were immediately killed on the spot. The 5 generals were sent in chains to King Artaxerxes in Babylon, where, after a brief trial, they were beheaded. To completely break the spirit of the Greeks, the Persian cavalry rode up to their camp and displayed the severed heads of some of their commanders. It was a gut punch, calculated to induce shock, terror, and complete demoralization. The army had lost its head, its entire senior command. According to the military logic of the time, such an army was doomed. It should have either scattered in panic or surrendered. Tissaphernes and the Persian king were confident that the game was over. They underestimated one thing: the spirit of freedom and the internal structure of Greek society, which could, in a moment of crisis, generate new leaders from its own ranks. For Artaxerxes II and his satraps, the situation seemed resolved. In their eyes, the Greek army was merely a tool that had broken after its master's death. With the execution of its commanders, this tool was now permanently disabled. The Persians, accustomed to a strict chain of command where everything depended on the will of one man, the king or general, could not imagine that this leaderless mass of barbarians was capable of self-organization. In their view, the mercenaries were a rabble driven only by a thirst for gold and fear of the whip. Deprive them of their leaders, and they would turn into a will-less herd that could be easily slaughtered or led into slavery. This moment was the peak of the Persian leadership's hubris. They celebrated not just a military victory, but the triumph of their world order, an order of despotism and treachery, over naive European directness and military valor. Tissaphernes, the chief architect of this plan, surely considered himself a brilliant strategist who had solved a complex problem with minimal losses. He could already envision the remnants of the Greek army, broken and humiliated, throwing their weapons at his feet, begging for mercy. King Artaxerxes, having eliminated his rival brother and his formidable army, had consolidated his power and could now peacefully enjoy the fruits of victory. The full might of the empire, its countless armies, its vast distances, its harsh nature, was now directed at wiping these audacious foreigners from the face of the earth. The Persian cavalry began to circle the Greek camp like wolves around a flock of sheep, cutting off foragers, preventing the Greeks from moving, and waiting for hunger and despair to do their work. For the Persian command, it was only a matter of time. They made the classic mistake of all authoritarian systems. They mistook external structure for internal substance. They saw an army, but they did not see the hidden polis within it, a civic community capable of regenerating itself through democratic procedures. They thought they had killed the dragon by cutting off its head, not knowing they were facing a hydra capable of growing new ones. The night after the news of the betrayal was the darkest in the history of the campaign. A deathly silence fell over the Greek camp, broken only by the crackling of fires and the soft groans of the wounded. Apathy and terror, like ice-cold water, flooded the soldiers' souls. These men, who had faced death on the battlefield without fear, were now psychologically broken. The enemy was not on the field of battle, but in the very fabric of the world, in treachery, in deceit, in the realization that all rules of honorable warfare had been violated. They felt betrayed not only by the Persians, but by the gods themselves. Xenophon would later describe this state in his Anabasis. Few men tasted food that evening, few kindled a fire, and many did not come to their arms that night, but lay down to rest where they were, unable to sleep for grief and longing for their homelands, their parents, their wives and children, whom they never expected to see again. It was a state of collective depression, a psychological rock bottom. The soldiers, left without the commanders they were used to trusting, felt like orphans. It wasn't just the command structure that had vanished. The very idea of a future had disappeared. Everyone understood that they were thousands of kilometers from home, surrounded by countless enemies, without food, without guides, and most terrifyingly, without hope. Their campaign was over. All that was left was to die, from starvation, from the arrows of Persian horsemen, or in humiliating slavery. That night, no sentries were posted, no orders were given. The army, as a single organism, ceased to function. It lay paralyzed by despair, awaiting a dawn that, it seemed to all, would bring only final destruction. This was the moment when history could have taken a completely different turn. A single Persian assault would have been enough to finish off this amorphous, demoralized mass of men. But it was at this point of absolute zero, in this darkness where not a single spark seemed to remain, that the fire of rebirth was about to begin. It was on this very night, when despair reached its peak, that Xenophon stepped onto the stage of history. Until this moment, he had been merely an observer, a private individual with no official position. But it was his detachment and philosophical mindset that allowed him to maintain clarity of thought where professional soldiers had lost heart. While others lay in apathy, Xenophon, by his own account, could not sleep, pondering their catastrophic situation. He was not thinking about the inevitability of death, but about why no one was doing anything. And then, applying the Socratic method to himself, he asked a series of questions. Why am I lying here? Am I waiting for someone else to come and save us? But who? And what are we waiting for? Isn't our situation getting worse with every hour? This internal dialogue led him to a single conclusion. He had to act himself, and act immediately. He got up and found the surviving captains from the company of his fallen friend Proxenus. He gathered them and addressed them with a speech that became the turning point of the entire story. It was not a thundering call to arms. It was a calm, logical, and irresistible analysis of the situation. He began by acknowledging the gravity of their plight, but immediately rejected despair as a useless emotion. He reminded them of the oaths they had sworn, of the gods who witnessed the Persians' treachery and therefore must now be on their side. He appealed to their pride as Hellenes, who had never been slaves. Then he moved on to practical matters, arguing that surrendering was tantamount to a torturous death, and therefore the only way out was to fight. "I would rather die in battle than be deceived," he declared. His words, backed by iron logic, ignited a fire in the hearts of the captains. They agreed with him. At his suggestion, they immediately went through the entire camp, woke the remaining officers, and gathered them for a general council before dawn. At this council, Xenophon spoke again, elaborating on his ideas. He proposed to immediately elect new commanders to replace the slain ones, to burn all non-essentials, including tents and wagons, to make the army as mobile as possible, and to begin a fighting retreat northwards, towards the Black Sea. His speech, his energy, his clear mind in a situation of total chaos made a huge impression. He breathed life back into the paralyzed body of the army. That night was his birth as a leader. The philosopher observer died, and in his place, a general was born. After the fateful night council, the Greek army was transformed. It became something perhaps unprecedented in ancient history, a polis on the march, a mobile military republic. Following Xenophon's proposal, the soldiers immediately held elections. New generals were chosen to replace the 5 who had been killed. Among them, to his own surprise, was Xenophon himself, elected as the general for the troops of his late friend Proxenus. Thus, the Athenian intellectual, with no prior formal command experience, became one of the top leaders of a 10,000-man army overnight. Power in this army was no longer based on birthright or royal appointment, but solely on democratic legitimacy and personal authority. War councils were held regularly, and at these meetings, any soldier could voice his opinion. Xenophon, with his rhetorical skills, often dominated these assemblies, but he always persuaded rather than commanded. He explained his plans, listened to counter-arguments, and made decisions after securing the support of the majority. This was unheard of for armies of that time. This mobile democracy became the main source of the Greeks' moral strength. Every soldier felt he was not just a mercenary, but a citizen of this moving city-state. He wasn't merely executing an order, he was participating in its creation. This fostered an exceptionally high level of motivation and cohesion. When difficult decisions had to be made, for instance, to leave behind the wounded who could not be carried, the decision was made collectively, and everyone understood its tragic necessity. Of course, such a system had its drawbacks. Debates could drag on, and discipline sometimes wavered, but in critical moments it worked flawlessly. Xenophon acted not as a dictator, but as the first among equals, a wise advisor whose opinion was valued above all for his intelligence and foresight. He became the living embodiment of Plato's idea of the philosopher king, albeit on a miniature, mobile scale. This unique socio-political organization allowed the army to maintain its unity and fighting spirit under inhuman conditions, turning the retreat of a motley crew of mercenaries into an epic odyssey of a free people. Survival in the heart of an enemy empire required not only moral fortitude, but also immediate tactical adaptation. The traditional Greek phalanx, invincible in a head-on clash on a plain, proved vulnerable on rough terrain and completely defenseless against the constant attacks of light Persian cavalry and archers. Tissaphernes, following the Greeks, adopted a strategy of attrition. His horsemen, like a pack of jackals, constantly harassed the flanks and rear of the retreating column, showering it with arrows and javelins, and immediately withdrawing whenever the hoplites attempted a counterattack. In the very first days of the march, the Greeks suffered significant losses, unable to strike back. It was at this moment that the military genius of Xenophon and the other newly elected commanders fully emerged. At a war council, Xenophon proposed a radical reorganization of the army. First, to defend against attacks from all sides, the army was reformed into a giant mobile hollow square, with the baggage train and non-combatants in the center. This allowed them to repel attacks from any direction. Second, special light infantry units were created to counter the enemy archers and cavalry. A contingent of Rhodians, renowned as the best slingers in the Greek world, was formed, capable of hurling lead bullets farther than the Persian arrows could fly. A small cavalry squadron of 50 horsemen was also created from those who still had their horses. These new mobile groups acted as fire brigades, quickly deploying from the square to repel the most dangerous attacks and cover the main force. But the most important innovation was the development of tactics for mountain warfare. When the army entered the lands of the warlike Carduchians, the phalanx became useless. Xenophon divided the army into smaller, autonomous units, lochoi, that could move more quickly up the slopes, storming one height after another. He introduced a leapfrog principle, where one unit would capture a position and provide covering fire for the advance of another. This flexibility, this ability to invent new tactics on the fly, became the key to the 10,000's military survival. They transformed their army from a cumbersome monolith into a versatile, multifunctional organism capable of adapting to any threat and any terrain. When the Greeks, fighting off the Persians, reached the foothills of Armenia, they encountered a new, even more ruthless enemy, nature. Winter had arrived, and the army entered a snow-covered, high-altitude plateau. The Persian army, unaccustomed to such conditions, abandoned the pursuit. But for the Hellenes, the most terrible ordeal began. Temperatures plummeted to extreme lows. The wind, as Xenophon writes, burned like fire, and the snow fell several meters deep. The soldiers, dressed in light Greek chitons and cloaks, were completely unprepared for such cold. Mass frostbite set in, with many losing fingers and toes. Another terrible affliction was snow blindness, a painful inflammation of the eyes from the bright sun reflecting off the snow. Provisions ran out. The army survived only on what it could seize from the sparse and impoverished Armenian villages. The men ate the meat of their pack animals, and when that was gone, starvation began. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion and froze to death on the march. The morale that had sustained them in battle against the Persians began to wane in the face of this silent, icy death. Despair once again gripped the army. In this critical moment, Xenophon's role as a leader reached a new level. He transformed from a strategist into a father commander. He gave up his horse and marched on foot with the common soldiers, sharing all their hardships. When he saw someone collapse from fatigue, he would approach, encourage them, and sometimes, as he himself describes, force them to keep going with curses and shoves, knowing that to stop meant to die. He personally split firewood for the campfires to warm the freezing. He organized aid for the sick and frostbitten, compelling the stronger to carry the weak. One of the most vivid episodes in the Anabasis is when Xenophon comes across a group of soldiers who have simply sat down in the snow to die. He tries to get them up, but they ask to be left alone. He then orders some Persian prisoners walking by to shake them, and the sight of their enemies caring for them shames the Greeks and forces them to get back on their feet. This personal example, this indomitable will and constant concern for his men, allowed Xenophon to lead the army through a frozen hell where military discipline alone would have been powerless. After the frozen wastes of Armenia, the Greeks' path lay through the lands of the Carduchians, fierce and warlike mountaineers believed to be the ancestors of the modern Kurds. These tribes had never been conquered by the Persian kings and considered their mountains inviolable. To them, the Greek army was just another group of invaders to be destroyed. Here, in the narrow, rocky gorges, the Greeks faced a completely new type of warfare: guerrilla warfare. Their heavy phalanx was useless. The Carduchians did not engage in open battle. They set ambushes, rolled rocks down onto the soldiers from above, showered them with arrows from cover, and then vanished into the mountains they knew like the back of their hand. The 7 days the army spent crossing the lands of the Carduchians turned into a relentless nightmare. Their losses were enormous, perhaps even greater than in all their battles with the Persians. It was a war without rules, without a front line, where danger lurked behind every rock. The Greeks, accustomed to honorable shield-to-shield combat, were demoralized by this invisible threat. In this critical situation, Xenophon once again demonstrated his tactical flexibility. He realized that traditional methods had to be abandoned. He formed flying columns of the lightest and most mobile soldiers, who scrambled up the slopes ahead of the main force to dislodge the Carduchians from the commanding heights. He used captured guides to find bypass trails. But most importantly, he maintained the soldiers' morale, explaining the enemy's tactics and urging extreme caution. He was constantly in the most dangerous places, sometimes in the vanguard, storming another pass, sometimes in the rearguard, repelling attacks on the stragglers. He was the brain and heart of the resistance. The passage through the Carduchian mountains was a harsh school of survival for the Greeks. They learned to fight in the mountains, to rely on the initiative of small units, and to value cunning as much as courage. They paid a high price for these lessons, but when they emerged from those cursed gorges, they were an even more battle-hardened and experienced army, capable of facing any threat. This week of unceasing terror was yet another testament to the fact that their will to live was stronger than any obstacle. Maintaining unity in an army composed of men from dozens of different city-states, each with its own pride and prejudices, was a task no less difficult than fighting enemies. Throughout the entire march, Xenophon had to wage a constant internal battle, quelling conflicts and overcoming political intrigues. The army was a microcosm of the political fragmentation of Greece. The Spartans considered themselves born leaders. The Arcadians boasted of their numbers, and the Athenians of their intellect. This internal tension periodically erupted into open clashes. One of Xenophon's main opponents at times was his fellow general, the Spartan Chrysippus. As a representative of Sparta, the hegemon of Greece, Chrysippus often laid claim to sole command, but he lacked both the charisma and the oratorical talent of Xenophon to truly lead the men. Their relationship was a complex mix of cooperation and rivalry. In moments of crisis, they worked together, but as soon as the danger passed, old tensions resurfaced. Furthermore, there were always demagogues and troublemakers in the army who tried to undermine the commander's authority, accusing them of all misfortunes or of secret collusion with the enemy. More than once, Xenophon had to address the soldiers' assemblies, using logic and eloquence to refute false accusations. He was not afraid of direct dialogue with the discontented. He held proper trials where anyone could voice their grievances, and the verdict was decided by a general vote. This was a risky but necessary approach in the conditions of a mobile democracy. For example, when he was accused of striking soldiers, Xenophon delivered a speech explaining that in critical situations, when a man is freezing or panicking, a sharp physical jolt can save his life. He invited the soldiers to judge for themselves whether his actions were driven by cruelty or concern, and the army acquitted him. This constant struggle for the hearts and minds of the soldiers demanded immense psychological strain from Xenophon. He had to be not only a general, but also a diplomat, a judge, a psychologist, and an orator. His ability to manage internal conflicts, find compromises, and maintain a unity of purpose in this diverse mass of men was no less a feat than his tactical victories. Throughout this epic odyssey, fate brought Xenophon and his army into contact with numerous individuals who became either temporary allies or sworn enemies. Among the allies, albeit a complex one, the Spartan Chrysophus stood foremost. As a Lacedaemonian, he held inherent authority in an army with many Peloponnesians. He often commanded the vanguard, clearing the path for the main column. His Spartan endurance and courage were unquestionable. However, his thinking was linear and often lacked flexibility. He was a product of the Spartan military system and struggled to accept Xenophon's innovative ideas. Their relationship was a constant dialogue between two different mentalities: Athenian intellectualism and Spartan directness. They would argue heatedly one moment and effectively complement each other the next. Chrysophus was the battering ram. Xenophon was the nerve center. Without their shaky but effective alliance, the army would have scarcely remained manageable. The sworn enemy, the shadow that haunted the 10,000, was undoubtedly the satrap Tissaphernes. Even after his army fell behind, his name remained a symbol of treachery and cunning. He was the enemy who taught the Greeks to trust no one. His betrayal was a bitter but vital lesson for them. Another distant enemy was King Artaxerxes II himself, a faceless and remote power embodying the full might of the Persian Empire that sought to destroy them. But there were other, more situational friends and foes. The Armenian governor Anabasis initially feigned friendship and made a truce, but then tried to ambush the Greeks at a mountain pass. Only Xenophon's vigilance saved the army from another trap. The chieftains of hostile tribes like the Carduchians or the Tyochians were fierce and uncompromising enemies. On the other hand, the Greeks sometimes managed to find temporary allies. The ruler of a region in Asia Minor, Pharnabazus, also proved to be a treacherous adversary, but unlike Tissaphernes, they eventually managed to negotiate with him. And a village chief, who became their guide, led them to the sea, becoming their savior for a short time. The entire history of the march is a kaleidoscope of changing faces, where a friend could become an enemy at any moment, and life sometimes depended on a foe. Xenophon had to be a shrewd psychologist to navigate this world of intrigue and shifting allegiances. After months of inhuman trials, after the frozen hell of Armenia and the bloody gorges of the Carduchians, came a moment that would forever be etched in the annals of history as a symbol of the triumph of the human spirit over insurmountable odds. The army was ascending another mountain, which the locals called Theches, Chrysophus leading the vanguard, and Xenophon in the rearguard, suddenly heard a growing shout from ahead. At first, they thought it was another enemy attack. The shouting grew louder and louder, and the soldiers from the rear, thinking a battle had started up front, began to run uphill to help their comrades. Xenophon mounted his horse, and with a small detachment galloped forward, expecting to see a terrible battle scene. But when he reached the summit, A completely different sight met his eyes. The soldiers were not fighting. They were standing, embracing each other, crying, laughing, and pointing towards the horizon. And all of them, as one, were chanting two words: Thalatta, Thalatta. The sea, the sea. There, to the north, in the bluish haze, lay the glittering strip of the Pontus Euxinus, the Black Sea. For these men, born and raised on the shores of the Aegean and Ionian seas, the sea was not just a geographical feature. It was a symbol of home. It was the road to Greece. It was the end of their endless wandering through foreign, hostile lands. To see the sea meant to be saved. It was a catharsis, an emotional explosion that washed away all the accumulated fatigue, pain, and despair. Hardened veterans who had not shed a tear when they lost friends in battle or watched their comrades freeze to death in the snow now wept like children. They piled up a huge cairn of stones on the mountaintop as a sign of gratitude to the gods. This cry, Thalatta, Thalatta, that rippled through the ranks of the 10,000-strong army became a cry of triumph, not only over the Persians, the mountains, and the winter, but over fate itself. It was the highest point of their odyssey, the moment for which it was worth enduring all the horror. They were not home yet. Many trials still lay ahead. But at that moment on Mount Theches, they had already won. They had proven that even from the deepest abyss of despair, a path to the light can be found. Upon reaching the coast of the Black Sea near the Greek colony of Anabasis, the 10,000 breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed their ordeal was over. They were back in the Hellenic world, among people who spoke their language and worshipped the same gods. However, the reality proved far more complicated. For the Greek colonies, living their own isolated lives on the edge of the barbarian world, the sudden appearance of 8,000, the number that remained by then, battle-hardened, ragged, and hungry warriors was not a joyous event, but a massive problem. They were a force to be reckoned with, but one that nobody wanted to host. The people of Anabasis offered them initial aid. They provided a market for them to buy provisions and took in the sick and wounded. But they made it clear that they could not and would not support such a horde for long. Thus began a new stage of the 10,000's odyssey, a phase of political intrigue and humiliating searches for refuge. The army that had just fought its way through half the Persian Empire had now become an army of outcasts, a burden to its own countrymen. No city would willingly provide them with ships to return to Greece. Xenophon and the other commanders had to use all their diplomatic skills to negotiate with the authorities of each colony. They moved from city to city along the southern coast of the Black Sea, to Cerasus, Kotiora, Sinope, Heraclea. The same story repeated everywhere: a brief, wary reception, meager assistance, and a persistent desire to be rid of them as quickly as possible. This created new tensions within the army itself. The soldiers, who felt they deserved a hero's welcome, were embittered and disappointed. Discipline began to fray again. One faction of the army wanted to continue overland, plundering local tribes, while another demanded ships be found at any cost. The authority of Xenophon and the other commanders was constantly tested. They were no longer heroes surviving behind enemy lines. They had become leaders of an unruly mob of refugees, feared and despised by all. This period was perhaps an even more severe moral test for them than the crossing of the snow-covered mountains. In this new phase of the journey, when the enemy was no longer external but internal, in the form of despair, hunger, and political intrigue, the struggle for survival continued with renewed vigor. Greek colonies like Sinope and Heraclea feared the 10,000 while simultaneously trying to use them. They saw them not as countrymen in distress, but as a dangerous military instrument that could either protect or destroy. Backroom deals and betrayals began. Some Greek politicians tried to bribe individual commanders to split the army. Others spread rumors to turn the soldiers against their leaders. The Spartan admiral Anabasis, stationed in Byzantium, initially promised to provide ships and pay if the army came to him. But when the exhausted soldiers finally reached Byzantium, he deceived them, attempting to immediately expel them from the city without money or provisions. This deception triggered a furious mutiny. The soldiers, feeling betrayed yet again, stormed into the city and nearly sacked it. Only the immense personal influence of Xenophon, who stood before the enraged mob and persuaded them not to bring upon themselves the disgrace of warring with another Greek city, saved Byzantium from destruction. This episode revealed how fragile order was within the army, and how great the soldiers' weariness was from the endless wandering and false promises. They were on the brink. They had traveled thousands of kilometers, defeated Persians, mountaineers, and nature itself, only to risk an ignominious end in a squabble with their own kinsmen. The struggle for survival had become a struggle to preserve their honor and human dignity. Xenophon and the other sane commanders understood that one more such breakdown, and the army would definitively degenerate into a band of marauders, to be hunted down and destroyed by all of Greece. They urgently needed to find a way out, a new purpose that would once again unite these desperate men. Despite the colossal authority Xenophon had earned during the retreat, he was not immune to mistakes in this final stage. Being a strategist first and a politician second, he sometimes showed naivety in negotiations and trusted the wrong people. For instance, at one point, persuaded by an adventurer, he seriously considered a plan to found a new colony on the Black Sea coast. This idea appealed to some soldiers tired of wandering, but it enraged those who wanted to return home and the merchants from coastal cities who feared the competition. This almost led to a schism in the army. Xenophon had to publicly renounce the plan to restore unity. However, his oratory skills and ability to find a way out of the most tangled situations continued to save the army. After the mutiny in Byzantium, the situation seemed hopeless. But just then, a new opportunity arose. The Thracian king Xeuthus II, who was trying to reclaim his father's kingdom from his enemies, learned of the formidable Greek army's arrival and decided to hire them. For the 10,000, this was a lifeline. Xeuthus offered them pay, food, and winter quarters. The soldiers, exhausted by hunger and uncertainty, gladly accepted. Thus, having barely escaped one war, they immediately became embroiled in another. Xenophon, though he already longed to return home, understood that this was the only way to keep the army intact and ensure its sustenance. He became a close advisor to Xeuthus, and with him, conducted a successful winter campaign against hostile Thracian tribes. This period was full of mud, blood, and night raids, a barbaric kind of war, nothing like the classic hoplite battles. But it allowed the army to survive the winter, earn some money, and feel wanted again. This final act of their odyssey was not heroic, but purely pragmatic. It showed who they truly were, professional soldiers of fortune, for whom war was a trade and the only means of existence. The final push for home proved to be no less dramatic and full of irony than the entire preceding journey. After several months of service under the Thracian king Xeuthus, who also tried to cheat the Greeks out of their full pay, the army once again found itself at a crossroads. It was precisely at this moment that representatives from Sparta approached them. A new war was brewing in Asia Minor. Sparta, once an ally of the Persians, was now in conflict with them and urgently needed experienced soldiers. And so, the Spartan commanders remembered the legendary army of the 10,000, battle-hardened, experienced veterans who knew Persian tactics firsthand. The Greeks were offered service with Sparta to fight in Asia. For most of the soldiers, this was the perfect solution. They were returning to their familiar trade, but now under the banner of the most powerful state in Greece. The circle was complete. Nearly 2 years after they had left Asia, they were returning to fight the Persians again. The irony of fate was that one of their main adversaries in this new war was to be the satrap Tissaphernes, the very man who had treacherously murdered their first commanders. The opportunity to take revenge on their sworn enemy was, for many, the final push to accept the Spartan offer. In the spring of 399 BC, the remnants of the 10,000, about 6,000 men, were transported across the straits to Asia Minor and incorporated into the Spartan army. Their great odyssey was over. They did not return home as triumphant heroes, showered with gold and glory. They returned to where they had started, as mercenaries. Their expedition had not brought them wealth, but it had given them something far greater: immortal fame and a unique experience of survival that forever changed them and became a part of military history textbooks. They had left as a motley crew of adventurers and returned as a unified brotherhood, forged in blood and shared suffering. The resolution of this incredible story was unexpected and full of irony. The army, having passed through fire and water, did not disband and return to their homes after a triumphant return. Instead, as a single organism, it simply changed employers. Their journey ended not in their homeland, but on a new theater of war where their unique skills were once again in demand. They received no parades, no honors. They simply went back to work. It was the most honest and logical end for an army of professional mercenaries. Their home was where there was war and pay for it. For Xenophon himself, the ending was even more ironic. He, an Athenian, had led the army into the service of Sparta, his native city's bitterest enemy. For this, as well as for his aristocratic views and his friendship with the executed Socrates, Athens sentenced him to exile in absentia. The man who had saved thousands of Greeks and dreamed of returning to his homeland was cast out by it. He continued to serve the Spartans, fought under King Agesilaus, and even battled against his fellow Athenians at the Battle of Coronea. As a reward for his loyal service, the Spartans gifted him an estate in Sicily, in Elis, near Olympia. It was here, far from high politics and war, that his journey came to an end. The paradox was that his exile gave him what he might never have found in Athens: the leisure and peace to reflect on his experiences. It was here, in the tranquility of his estate, that the former general who had saved 10,000 lives took up his stylus and began the masterwork of his life. He decided to write down everything he had seen and endured, so that the world would know of his comrades' feat. Thus was born the Anabasis, the March Up, a work that immortalized both himself and his army. The ironic finale of his wanderings turned into the greatest gift for posterity. Death found Xenophon in his old age, around 354 BC, likely in Corinth. He had lived a long and eventful life, having been a philosopher's student, a warrior, a general, an exile, and finally, a writer. His physical journey was over, but his true journey through time was just beginning. Unlike many generals whose fame dies with them, Xenophon's legacy proved to be twofold and virtually eternal. His first legacy is practical. His book, the Anabasis, is not just a memoir. It is a detailed textbook on military tactics, logistics, psychology, and leadership in extreme conditions. Generations of military commanders, from antiquity to the present day, have studied his work. They learned from him how to organize a retreat, adapt tactics to the terrain, maintain morale, and manage an army on democratic principles. But Xenophon's most important and immediate student was Alexander the Great. Before his campaign into Asia, the young king and his generals thoroughly studied the Anabasis. The story of the 10,000 provided them with invaluable information. First, it showed that even a small but disciplined Greek army could defeat vast Persian forces. Second, it exposed the internal weakness of the Persian Empire, its fragility and vulnerability in the face of a determined invasion. Xenophon's campaign was, in essence, a great reconnaissance in force. He paved the moral and intellectual road for Alexander's future conquests. He proved that the Colossus stood on feet of clay and showed exactly how it could be toppled. Without the Anabasis, Alexander's campaign might have been very different, or might not have happened at all. Xenophon's second legacy is literary and philosophical. He became one of the fathers of the memoir genre, demonstrating how historical events could be described in a way that was both engaging and truthful. His clear and simple language became a model of Attic prose. But most importantly, he left the world a story not of conquest, but of return, not of the triumph of force, but of the triumph of the spirit. His book is an eternal monument to resilience, mutual support, and an indomitable will to live. So, how did he do it? How did an Athenian philosopher intellectual lead 10,000 desperate warriors home through a hostile empire? The key to this paradox, this miracle, lies not in a single factor, but in a unique synthesis of qualities that came together in the person of Xenophon and in the very nature of his army. First, he was able to do it because of his Socratic education. He was not just a commander, he was a thinking commander. He approached every problem, be it an attack by Persian cavalry or a mutiny in his own camp, as an intellectual puzzle to be solved with logic and analysis. He did not follow a script. He constantly invented new tactics, new organizational structures, new psychological approaches. His main weapon was not the sword, but reason. Second, he was a master of rhetoric. In the conditions of a mobile democracy, where power depended on persuasion, his ability to speak, to inspire, to calm, and to lead was vital. His speeches, which he records in detail in the Anabasis, are masterpieces of practical psychology. He knew how to find the right words for any audience, appealing sometimes to honor, sometimes to common sense, sometimes to religious sentiment. He saved the army with his words, no less than with his deeds. Third, he embodied a new type of leader. He was neither a stern, Spartan dictator nor a populist demagogue. He was a leader-mentor who led by personal example. He froze, starved, and fought alongside his soldiers. His concern for them was genuine, and the men felt it. He personified the ideal of the shepherd who does not drive his flock, but walks ahead of it. Finally, the army itself was a unique organism. It was a polis on the march, a community of free citizens who elected their own leaders and collectively decided their own fate. This sense of shared purpose and collective responsibility generated incredible resilience. They fought not for a king or for pay, but for themselves, for their comrades, and for their right to return home as free men. Thus, the paradox of a retreat that became a triumph is resolved simply. It was a victory of the Hellenic spirit, a combination of reason, freedom, and personal valor, over a faceless, despotic power. Xenophon did not just lead men out, he led an idea out, and the idea proved stronger than the empire. Ultimately, the story of Xenophon and the 10,000 transcends the bounds of a military chronicle or an adventure novel. It becomes a universal parable about human nature, leadership, and survival. It is a narrative that speaks to every era in its own language because it touches on eternal themes. It is a story about how, in moments of absolute crisis, when all external supports, authority, hierarchy, law, collapse, the only anchor becomes the individual, their inner core, their will, and their reason. Xenophon showed that a true leader is born not from titles, but from the ability to take responsibility at the moment when everyone else sheds it. He proved that the most powerful weapon is not steel, but the word capable of turning a mob into a people and despair into determination. His Odyssey is a hymn to adaptability. In a world that is constantly changing, it is not the strongest who survives, but the most flexible, the one who can learn, unlearn, and find unconventional solutions. The Greeks survived because they were able to evolve on the move, transforming their cumbersome phalanx into a versatile military organism. But perhaps the main lesson of this story is about the very nature of victory. What is true victory? To conquer the world, as Alexander would later do? Or finding oneself at rock bottom in a situation of complete hopelessness? To refuse to break, to preserve one's humanity and sense of comradeship, and to lead one's people to the light. The march of the 10,000 brought the Greeks neither land nor gold, but it gave them and all of humanity something far more valuable, irrefutable proof that the human spirit, armed with reason and freedom, is capable of achieving the impossible. It is the story of how a death march can become a path to immortality, and why a retreat home sometimes requires more courage and valor than the most glorious conquest.